Here's the book. If you haven't read it, it's a real corker. So The Human Edge, How Curiosity and Creativity Are Your Superpowers in the Digital Economy. And it's about many things, Greg, as we will find out. But look, maybe to start with, why did you write this book at this time, Greg, just to kind of get us into it?
Sure. Thanks, Rob. Well, it came, as always, in any moment of creativity from, I think, an interesting question that was asked to me. I'd already written a book that came out in 2014 called The Spark, and that was how you lead and manage for creativity. And that's been a lot of my career, is understanding the role of business creativity and its connection to innovation for people and organizations. So about 5 years ago, I started getting very interested in the role of technology in organizational change and society. I'm not a technologist, but on the impact of it from a cultural perspective in organizations. And I was giving a speech to the alumni of London Business School a little while after that, talking about the impact of artificial intelligence and digital technology on organizations. And a lady came up to me at the end, senior kind of CEO, and she said, listen, I'm interested in the organizational stuff, but what about me? And what about my daughters? What skills and capabilities do they need? You've been talking about artificial intelligence and how to differentiate from machines. What do we need? What should we learn to stay relevant in the next 20 to 30 years? And I remember having a really poor answer to it. I kind of ummed and ahed and thinking, that's a really good question. I don't know the answer. And that just set me off on the journey to write The Human Edge. And so The Human Edge turned into not a management book. I'd sort of written one of those already, although I think it would be useful in the hands of managers and leaders because they've got so much leverage. It's really more of a kind of a subversive manual that you can keep underneath your desk, even if your boss is a completely toxic boss and doesn't get it, to actually protect and foster your own human superpowers in this machine age that we're in.
Hi, Greg. It's Amy. Hopefully you can see me on the screen.
Yes, I can. Hi, Amy.
Hiya. I've got to start by just saying how much I loved reading this book. Right from the beginning of the book, you do this amazing analogy right up front on the human brain, and kind of likening it to kind of passing a wire around thousands of Londoners and, timesing that by 10,000. And I kind of knew as I read that analogy that, this book was going to be for me, because it was just, there was a real art of storytelling throughout it as well, really interesting case studies as well. And yeah, I just had a really great time reading it. And I've actually been walking around quoting your book to anyone who will listen to me, family, friends, colleagues, all of them. And the kind of the key part of your book around which everything is centered is your 4C model. And I think for people who haven't read the book, it would just be really great to bring that to life a bit more and explain to people what the 4C model is.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, Amy, thank you for making my day. I think we should probably just leave this session now. I can't think it's going to get any much better than that. You've been quoting it to your family. How lovely. Thank you. So, yeah, I'll give, absolutely. I think it's the heart of the book. I'll give a little bit of how it came about. And then I'll just very briefly run through the 4Cs, which I'm sure will provoke lots and lots of questions from this very informed group of people. So the book, the kind of the why, I wrote the book, which you need for anything to sort of a peg to hang it on, was the froth and the hype surrounding artificial intelligence, and of course, when you start writing a book, this is like four years ago, that it was going to destroy human jobs and take over. And to a certain extent, of course, COVID took over as the lead news item for a couple of a year. That's still around. So I wanted to just look into that. I thought it was an interesting question. And I came up with after reading a lot of technologists, that yes, AI will take certain jobs. So if your job is so routine, all of your job is so routine and algorithmic that you can write an algorithm that replaces every decision point and process within that job, it will go. And so, junior tax preparers, personal assistants to a certain extent, long distance lorry drivers. These are people whose jobs in their entirety might go in the next 4 or 5 years. But then I found actually what was really interesting is for the rest of us, for knowledge workers whose jobs are a bit more complex, what will happen is the certain skills, the routine skills in our jobs will be cheese sliced away by AI. And so I think what's important to me, I bring a positive and hopeful message that while that's happening, it leaves a space that's uniquely human. And this is the great irony, that as machines and digital technology and AI take more of a space in our lives, it will be paid to be more human, not less. So I then focused on, well, what does it mean to be more human, to provide things that machines can't? Because where they are strong, we are weak, and vice versa. So I came up with this 4 C's model that's based on obviously experience, a lot of the forecasts of other people looking at this, such as the World Economic Forum and McKinsey's and et cetera, and then try to really make it real for people, to give people practical points. So the 4 C's model is consciousness, curiosity, creativity, and collaboration. And I did them in that order because there is a kind of a narrative to that order, but I also wrote 2 dance steps underneath each of those 4 C's. So there's kind of 8 units in this book. And the reason I call them dance steps is because creativity and innovation is such actually a labyrinthine and circuitous process. It's not a straight line. It normally doubles back on itself several times. The dance steps is, if you learn one dance step, you can combine them with many others in any form you need them to be in. So maybe just one other layer of detail, Amy, I think people will just get curiosity and creativity. I go into depth of what that really means. Collaboration, similarly intuitive. Consciousness breaks out into 2 dance steps, and that is the ability to find meaning in your work that is beyond profit, that actually makes you want to get up in the morning. And I talk about the neuroscience and psychology behind that, because that provides the courage to be creative. And the second one I didn't expect to write about at all, but I ended up writing about, was focus. And I think people have already mentioned this on the call. Somebody said, I found myself going away and thinking and coming back and collaborating better. So that is the ability to say, in a digitally distracted world, it's getting harder and harder to focus. So therefore, if you can focus and think deeply, and that leads to creativity, you'll be more and more valuable. So I cover that under consciousness. So consciousness is meaning and focus, and the others sort of flow from there, if you like.
And picking up on your point about consciousness, because again, I found this section really fascinating, and that whole concept around how do you actually kind of motor your creativity with all the distraction that's around us. And actually across all of those building blocks that you talk about, those 4 C's, we find ourselves right now in an almost entirely kind of virtual existence. We're working at home, we're at home all the time, we've got distractions around us, we've got emails popping up, we've got WhatsApp, Slack, we've got Zoom, we've got Teams. We're just constantly interrupted. And there's this great kind of stat that you put in, and you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, if I've remembered this wrong, because this is what I've been quoting to everyone, that when we get interrupted, it takes us about 25 minutes to get ourselves back on track. And that on average, we're being interrupted every 11 minutes. So what hope have we actually got in ever kind of maintaining any focus? So I just thought it would be great just to learn a bit more from you about how do we maintain our focus, and why is that so important for innovation and creativity?
Yeah, and as I say, it doesn't really compute, does it, immediately, because creativity doesn't feel it's about productivity and focus, but actually it is. And my favorite quote about it is from a New York Times writer. And he says that great creative minds might think like artists, but they work like accountants. And I absolutely love that. And I also love the idea that, if you think, I use by the way, you quoted it exactly right. Those are the studies, but they say 11 minutes, but some studies say we're being interrupted a lot, actually more rapidly than that. I was being conservative, but it does take you 25 minutes to get back into what psychologists call a state of flow. And that is where you are highly productive. Actually, some studies say 5 times more productive than the rest of the time. So the whole point of the focus thing is we all have to do a load of stuff every day. If you can truncate the stuff that you do into smaller segments, you have more time to think more deeply and be creative and have those serendipitous moments we were just discussing. So actually productivity is completely key. And obviously we're being distracted on an industrial scale more than ever before with cognitively addictive social media apps that, and they built them to be that way. So, I use the silly example of Albert Einstein that famously did his creative work when he put his work as a patent clerk in Bern in Switzerland aside for the day. He would turn to the theory of relativity. And I asked the question, what would have happened if he'd had an Instagram account and 300 emails every day? So I think, obviously Einstein is a quote unquote genius, but the rest of us have to protect our own genius, have to protect our own time. So that's why I came up with that. And as I said, didn't expect to write about it because I thought productivity and time management was a rather kind of menial middle management type topic. The people I meet at London Business School, all the senior executives, it's one of their major issues.
There's a really delightful story in the book of Twyla Tharp. And Twyla Tharp is a New York dance choreographer. And you talk about how at the start of every creative assignment, at that moment when she really doesn't know what she's going to do here, she's maybe just got the brief or whatever. One of the things she does is she gets a cardboard box and she fills it with stuff. Can you tell us, from a point of kind of creativity practice, what's going on for her? Why does she do that?
Yeah, and what's interesting is when you write a book, you think you know the subject. I'd already written a book about managing, leading creativity, and I realized this was one of the big things I was teaching myself as I wrote this book. And really it gets to this idea of, we already used the word on this session before I came on, serendipity. So it's really encouraging serendipity for yourself, which is what Twyla thought, that sort of really inspiring thing she does. Now, she's really old school. She's using pre-digital idea. It's literally a cardboard box. She throws stuff in. And the point is, it takes a while for your brain and your subconscious brain to make these connections, these synaptic connections that actually lead to the spark of good ideas. So you need the fuel, which is why I put curiosity second after consciousness. It gathers the fuel for you. So your curiosity gathers this fuel, but you've got to put the work in. And what she does is she puts it in a cardboard box. You can do it digitally. Because I'm a writer, I use Evernote, which is a simple clipper of online material. Whenever I see something, I email myself on Evernote or save the page. Under little headings and my own little digital cardboard boxes. Then when I need to write a Forbes article, I go back and suddenly I'm sort of brainstorming with previous versions of myself. So I don't have to start from that awful, awful blank sheet of paper. And so really that whole idea, the meta idea that runs through the book is don't think about having better ideas. Have more ideas, because if you look at all of the creative superstars in every domain, chemistry, cooking, you name it, they don't have better ideas. They allow themselves and they put the work in to have more ideas, then they have a greater portfolio of things to choose from. And of course, it's a similar thing within organizations with the pre-creative stage of innovation. So that's where that Twyla Tharp comes from, Rob.
Yeah, lovely. And there's something in there, isn't there, Greg, about kind of trusting our unconscious to do some of the work, in the background, having stimulated ourselves up front, I guess.
Yeah. And really understanding the science that is becoming clearer and clearer about what is happening underneath the surface of those dark waters of our unconsciousness, that trusting it's there. So I, personally speaking, after writing this book, I do this more and more. I start an idea on Monday and then I just leave it for a while. I go and sleep. I mean, it reminds me of this. I think there's another story in there. I forget quite what made it into the book and what didn't. But Thomas Edison, the famous inventor of, quote unquote, inventor of the light bulb, although we know he didn't. He actually used to enjoy that moment just before sleep takes over, where you're in this kind of liminal zone between waking and sleeping, which is a very fertile area after sleeping as well, which is why we often have our ideas in the shower and things like that. And he used to fall asleep in a chair with 2 steel balls in his hands. And when he fell asleep and the balls hit the ground, he'd write down what was on his mind. So obviously you don't need to be that slightly cranky, but I do think helping your brain, just giving it a helping sort of start by feeding it curious questions, bits and pieces, because we all know, don't we? And I'm sure this isn't new to people on this session, that innovation and creativity often happen when an idea from one domain of knowledge kind of jumps the fence and is suddenly in a new domain of knowledge, and it changes the nature of that, and suddenly you get a new idea. That's what happens, both neurologically, that's a synaptic connection, and also in terms of knowledge going from one place to another. I mean, I was talking to someone the other day about silly example of this. I don't know if you know, Rob, why we have all these, we have hundreds of fonts in our word processing programs on computers. Well, it was because the late Steve Jobs, after he kind of quit college, but he used to keep going back to courses that he was curious about. And he went into a calligraphy course and became really interested in the art of handwriting. And so that small experience back in, I suspect that would be like the early 70s, made him a complete font nerd for the rest of his life. And then when it came to designing the Mac, of course, it was the first to have all these amazing fonts. So that's an example of calligraphy jumping the fence into computer science. So kind of interesting to me.
Yeah.
Greg, that brings up a really interesting point, actually, because I think you're starting to kind of touch on some of the different ways of thinking that you talk about in the book. So you talk about divergent and convergent thinking, and as how when we're children, our brains, you use this analogy, our brains are like a glass of water. So when we take in information, it all just kind of goes into the mix. And so we don't question so much the relation between those topics. And so we're kind of more divergent in our way of thinking. And then as we kind of grow up and we're taught, our creativity kind of drops off a cliff, and our brains become much more like ice cubes. So we start to compartmentalize everything. And it's, largely, I guess, how we're educated and brought up is influencing that. But what it does is it means when somebody asks us to solve a problem, we go to a specific ice cube. We don't look at everything in the mix. So we're avoiding that divergent thinking, which is probably going to be more revolutionary than the convergent way of thinking, which is it's in this ice cube, so I can improve the topic within these bounds, but I'm not really kind of exploring what else I could do with it. And I find that all really fascinating. And I just thought maybe you'd have some more comments around divergent thinking and how it can enable us to be more creative and innovative, really.
Yeah, it's a great question, Amy. And, I think maybe we should relate it to trying to lead and facilitate creativity and innovation in organizations, because, my experience of the session so far is that a lot of people are doing that professionally. And it was what I observed, I'm often presented with a brief by large corporates saying, we'd like our middle managers and senior managers to be more adaptive and agile and creative and innovative and all these buzzwords. And despite that, the fact that if anyone fails around here, they normally get sacked. So that's effectively the challenge we're presented with at London Business School and elsewhere, to try and help people to do this. And my observation, very broadly, of large corporates, they're absolutely world class at convergent thinking, at taking several ideas and then going, right, let's absolutely get this to something that could be rolled out. That's not something I generally have to help them with. They've already got that. What happens, and this is happening at an organizational level and for us personally, is this idea, as you say, to melt the ice cubes, to make those ideas jump the fence. And it comes from some very seminal work that started in the 60s and 70s by a psychologist called George Land, talking about how effectively, just to sort of summarize it, our creativity just reduces every 5 years or so from the age of 3 or 4, when we're all, if you look at all the creative tolerance type tests for creativity, right, they're kind of creative geniuses when we're 4 or 5. And if you've got kids, or you've had kids, or you've got nieces and nephews, they're brilliant at divergent thinking. You put them on a settee for the afternoon, and it can be a spaceship, a pirate ship, a boxing ring, a stage, and it will be those things because that's the way their brains work. So effectively, George Land did this 25-year study and said, yes, school kills our creativity. And so by the way, does work, because it's an environmental factor. So I think that's very depressing. So to give you a kind of like the upside to that, I always try and see the upside is, the silver lining to that is what he said in the conclusion of his report is uncreative thinking is a learnt capability. So you learn to be uncreative through school and through work. And so anything that can be learned can be unlearned, and that's the mission of my book, to unlearn it, to actually rediscover that divergent thinking that you had before. And what I try and do with the book is creativity is this big word that's right up there that people feel very inaccessible to. But if you look at the subwords that fall underneath it, we can all do those. We can all question, we can all learn new things, we can all connect with other people. Somebody used the word empathy earlier, but that is proven now to be a learnable and developable, if that's a word, skill. So we can do the sub things that actually create our ability to be curious and creative. So I've wound myself in a circle there, Amy. I think I've answered your question, but that's effectively the backdrop of why, effectively, if you're a leader in an organization, just to finish off, and I will stop rabbiting in a minute, I say, and this goes back to my first book, your job is to facilitate the creative process and to understand how other people are getting involved. And for that, you need a really fine and almost intuitive understanding of when you're in a divergent stage of thinking, when that stops, because the rules completely change at that point, and then when you go into convergent thinking, because it's that bit in the middle, the more ideas, not better. And the decision when you go from more ideas, not better, to better ideas, which is the convergence, that you are in charge of. And that is the way you facilitate creativity around you, but by understanding where you are in the process and communicating it really clearly.
I'm interested, says Jane, in how we instill the 4 C's into young people to develop their skills.
Thank you, Jane. Was Jane the innovative, adventurous teacher from the start?
Yes.
I love that, Jane. So thank you for the question. It's interesting you should ask it, because when I was thinking about positioning the book, I was kind of determined not to write another management leadership book, but I wanted one that would be useful for managers and leaders, more useful because they've got so much leverage. And for a while, we thought about actually just writing it for teenagers, because if you think about the logic of it, if the world is changing and you need more human skills, and effectively, if someone reads a book when they're 18, they're going to get a lot more value out of it because they've got a much longer career. So I don't think I've got a real pat answer for how it's any different. I think the little experiments and the habits, I think of everything as a habitual, change is about habit change, are applicable to younger people, to teenagers. If anything, they'd probably find it easier, I suspect, because they're not as inculcated in organizations, which continues the process of slightly blunting your creative potential. What do you think, Jane?
I was going to say, I think the education system blunts creativity, collaboration, because they're actually meeting levels and exams. I say this as a former teacher, and I have the utmost respect for teachers. It's more the system I have a problem with. But I just wonder if teachers aren't aware of this, the 4 C's. Skills aren't actually measured on the curriculum. They're only briefly mentioned in the Gatsby benchmarks for careers. I'd love to see these. I haven't read the book, Greg, but I'm about to go and order it. How do we get this to those young brains, the ones that have got the creativity and are not being given those opportunities to put it into practice? I suppose that was the question.
Well, you know, my two sons have now, my youngest one is just down the corridor finishing his A-levels, and my eldest one is at university now. And I'm very grateful for the education that they got in our system. So please take what I say next as not a blanket criticism of our educational system or teachers, indeed. But, you know, I think we need to really re-examine our educational process and our system. Because it was, you know, like a lot of the organizations that I'm trying to change, the corporates, it was designed a long time ago. Actually, in the industry, it was effectively designed to make people good workers for factories, you know, and effectively the model was, let's get 30 people of the same age in a classroom, then they'll have a 45-minute session on the same subject, then a bell will go, and then they'll do another one, and they will not mix those subjects. They will learn those subjects to a rigid standard to which we will then ask them questions on. Exactly what they get will be their grade in life, and then they will leave, and then they will go and work in a industrial setting. And that kind of worked because that's what was required for the first, second and third industrial revolutions were really about bureaucracy and actually people going in and following the rules, and it released a lot of economic value. But we're now in a world where people need to go in, take risks, combine ideas. Organizations are getting flatter and flatter and flatter. So, you know, there are a number of things, you know, this should be taught. Creative thinking should be taught. It should be valued, and not just in the art block, but more widely. And also, I think, you know, an understanding of our own brains, which the Human Edge gets into quite a lot. So, you know, and this is being taught, and to be fair to the government, they're putting money behind CBT training, cognitive behavioral therapy. They're putting money behind mindfulness, which is proven to help with lowering anxiety levels, raising focus. It has correlation with creativity too. So I think there's so many things that we could include in the educational process that aren't, and I think it's a great shame. So I know I've been ranting, but that would be my take on it, Jane. I don't know what you think.
No, I agree. It's a passive learning system, and we could do so much better for our young people, because we don't want passive people. That, you know, we would probably want disruptors, wouldn't we? But in school, we're not particularly keen on disruptors. So,
and that was your first question, which I didn't answer. What about teachers? If you look at the studies about what teachers say and do, they're very different, and it's not their fault. And effectively, what most teachers say, if you ask them, do you like creativity? They all say, it's wonderful. There should be more of it. It's a marvelous thing. And then if you observe them teaching a class, they tend to favor the less creative pupils, quote unquote, because we know it's all in there, and favor the ones that are following the rules. Why? Because it's very hard to control 30 individual human beings in a class, and creative people are a pain in the butt. They ask annoying questions, they don't follow the rules, and they try and think for themselves. So this is why bosses do the same thing. And that's why I say it's not their fault. They are just trying to manage a system that is not encouraging that. And to be honest, I have got no answer for how you do that with the limited resources we've got. Maybe artificial intelligence is going to help. We'll find out.
thank you.
Greg, that's a really great segue into something else that we've got in the chat here, because you talk about, it's not just in education, it's in the workplace as well, that you know, we're kind of taught uncreativity because it's very difficult to manage those behaviors. So Miles has said, you know, there's a need for a foundation of trust within organizations to allow people to think and act differently. And I guess it would just be what your kind of thoughts are around that. So how we sort of apply some of that thinking into the workplace as well.
Yes, I mean, I couldn't agree more. You know, I think somebody said this earlier, trust, empathy, supporting people is required to make them, to help them to be more creative. I mean, of course, the creative process and the innovative process is not a cuddly kind of everybody all along, all your ideas are great kind of vibe. You know, obviously we want to release ideas at the start and then we don't judge them, but then we do judge them. We kill the worst ideas. Most ideas are terrible and they shouldn't make it into the product line. You know, that's the whole point of having a portfolio. So I think what we're getting at is a kind of what's become quite a trendy psychological phrase, which is psychological safety. It's been well studied, you know, it's very robust. And effectively, if you look at psychological safety and how it was come about, I believe it's Amy Edmondson from Harvard. She did some really interesting studies into teams that were more productive and creative in a hospital. And she found something that really surprised her, that actually the most creative and productive and high performing teams were those that made more mistakes. And she couldn't kind of work this out. And then she worked out they weren't making more mistakes, they were just acknowledging them and actually learning from them. So it turns out that that's at the root of psychological safety, which is when there is a mistake, an error, a failure of some kind, it's the leader's job to home in on it, not ignore it, but say, how do we learn from this? What happened here? Because obviously in there is some really, really interesting things. And also it sends a very strong signal to everybody that under certain conditions, failure is expected in our team because we're going to be pushing ourselves. So that level of trust is really important. But I would say one caveat to that, because there's been a lot of utter bilge, in my opinion, talked about failing fast and failing forward and all this kind of stuff, which I'm not saying you don't need to do that. But I've been lucky enough to work in Silicon Valley and go to Shanghai, all these kind of innovation hubs. And if you fail in one of those startup companies massively, and you waste lots and lots of money and egregiously, you still get fired. And, in my opinion, you probably should get fired. What this is all about, and someone used the magic word earlier of experimentation, is ensuring there's a system in which people can fail in very, very small and survivable ways. And that's a process, which is well documented in books like The Lean Startup and the Agile methodology. And that's what we should be moving towards. And I think that's the biggest point of leverage for these large organizations that need to do this. Do it small, do it in teams, do it in hotspot areas, and introduce this idea of psychological safety, curiosity, going into the mess, looking at where the failure is. And then, from that system, from that mess, hopefully good ideas and innovation will come.
Thank you, Greg. We have about 3-4 minutes left, and Greg, you will see there's lots of stuff in the chat that that you may want to respond to as well. I just want to invite Hugh in, because Hugh, I think you've had your hand up for a while. Do you have I don't know whether your question's been answered or whether it's still for going.
I don't know. The comment I wanted to make was, it's like Amy's ice cubes. And it speaks to the teaching thing, but it's about specialization. And by the time you get into businesses, and especially corporates, the inhibiting sort of structures are that you tend to have specializations and you can't think out of the boxes. So, the ice cubes are that children have to decide that they're going to be science or arts or whatever at a very early age, and then we're taught that we have to pass on the problem to the next specialist. There's a lot of rhetoric around cross-silo thinking and bashing people together, and the best times in my innovative sort of existence were when we did get anthropologists and psychologists and designers and scientists and engineers and techs all together, and it worked. And that's a whole other subject, but we don't do enough of it, and it's fundamentally we slip back into our specialisms and we pass it on to the guy who's going to do it next, all through the innovation cycle. Yeah,
I agree, Hugh. Do you want me to comment on that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. I think expertise is quite tricky, actually, and I struggled to write about it in the book. I did end up writing about it. I'm not sure I did the best job on it, because I think it's a very complex subject. And my take on it is, yes, you need expertise in a more collaborative world, because no one on this session, no one in the world could tell you how you make a smartphone. In fact, they did, I think King's College in London, they did an experiment where one guy even tried to make a toaster from first principles and could not do it. So we are in a very complex world where you need silos of expertise that really understand materials and all these kind of things. But I would say 2 points I make in the book. One, for those people who are deep experts, it's a great idea to find the time in order to roam more widely, because you will become a more creative person as a result of finding things out outside your area, and it will inform what's in your area, which is,
and
by the
that's
way,
curiosity.
Yeah, exactly. And why organizations like Pixar, who I'm a great fan of, teach judo and pottery and art and all sorts of things to their accountants and various other people, because they understand that process. And two, I think, you know, obviously we're aiming for more diverse workplaces, both from a gender and a race and an expertise and an age group perspective. That has got to help you. So I totally agree with you. Part of the art of this is bringing these people together and watching the sparks fly. So yes, I think that's a really important thing to be able to do. And maybe technology will enable us to do it more easily with less friction.
Thank you, Hugh. Thank you, Greg. I know we could go on, I think, for at least another hour, but we're about out of time on this one. So, Greg, thank you so much. People, could we unmute ourselves and give a slightly chaotic, slightly crazy round of applause, please?
Thanks, Greg. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed talking to you. I'm sorry all my answers were way too long. I get a bit overexcited, but I've really enjoyed being with you today.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. And I think we loved the spontaneity, and we all need plenty more of that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, have a great rest of your session.